your seats. We'll get started with what's brewing. It's going to be a great evening, and at this time, I'd like to introduce one of our new presenting sponsors, who will also welcome and thank all our other sponsors and has something fun for each one of you. Please welcome Sharon Smith with Bryant, Loveland, and Jarvis.
So my name is Sharon Smith, and I'm an attorney with Bryant, Loveland, and Jarvis, and we're a new sponsor for this event. And we want to start by giving away a hydro flask. And so what I'm going to do is pass around this green roll, put your card in. At the end of the night, we'll give somebody in the card. So I want to thank all the rest of the sponsors. Miller Lumber, Sunwest Builders, who are the platinum sponsors. Yes. And then we have Combined Communications, News Channel 21, Cascade Journal, and the Shoot Brewery, of course, right here. Thanks to all the sponsors for sponsoring tonight's evening event. And I'd also like to introduce our panelists. Janet Burton, Central Oregon Association of Realtors, Rob Moore, Arbor Mortgage, Sue Carrington, Ben Dutch Vacation Rentals, and John Skidmore. So thank you for being here. And our moderators tonight, let's see, Scott Ramsey, and Scott is with the Community Affairs Council, and Jamie Chrisman is the Director of Government Affairs and Leadership. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, welcome to the club, for sure. All right, well, vacation rentals, now deemed short-term rentals. We have a lot of subject matter to get through in a short amount of time. We have a great panel. That also goes on the assumption that each and every one of you are here, and we want you to just go total town hall on us and speak up and share. But before we do that, John Skidmore has taken some time this evening, pre-beer, thank you, John, to put together a quick rundown of the history and how we get where we are today with what you've been hearing about. As many of you know, a task force was formed in November. Sometimes, in fact, more often than not, you were at 6-hour meetings at least, right? Ooh, a lot of work out there. So, with no further ado, John, go ahead and give us the background, if you would.
Excellent. So, Sue and Rob were members of the task force, and Janet was diligently in every meeting. Stan Roach, sitting in the back, is also a task force member, and appreciate all of your dedication. Thanks. There we go. So it was supposed to be a series, I think, of 6 meetings that were going to be 3 hours each, and it quickly morphed into, I think, about 6+ meetings, most of which were 6+ hours. So, pretty emotional topic, and so I'll run you through the history of it. So how did we get here? What we've seen in specific areas.
You gotta put it close to your mouth.
Yeah, leave it close. And in fact, we've heard this one picks up the voices better, was the intel I just got. So, switch on. Is it?
Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay. And then,
With the
Scott,
reverb.
I can get the...
So, what we saw I'd say about this time last year, we saw a number of residents coming to City Council and Planning Commission concerned about the dramatic increase in vacation home rental permits in the city. Primarily, we were seeing these in 2 neighborhood association areas, the River West and the Old Bend Neighborhood Association. If you think about it, if you're coming to visit Bend, you want to be where the action is. Those are 2 great areas to be. You're close to Galveston, you're close to downtown, you're close to the river, you're close to the Schwab amphitheater. So we were seeing a lot of pressure there, and it really started creating a lot of compatibility and livability issues for those folks in the neighborhood. Not only, let's use the Galveston example, not only are you seeing more vibrant street there, and you're seeing more and more vibrant vibrant uses there that pushing parking in the neighborhoods and things, and there's a lot more bike traffic. We've got the cycle pup cruising through these areas, so a lot of activity in the downtown cores that was really affecting a lot of long-term residents who moved there to have a residential lifestyle, not necessarily be the life of the party. At that time, council decided that it was time to put together a task force to look at this, comprised of folks on both sides, or I guess all sides of the discussion, so that we can have a nice, well-rounded discussion and come back to council with a proposed program. What this shows is the green. This is the River West neighborhood. This is the Old Bend neighborhood. As you can see, that is where the majority of the pressure was. I think over the course of about 6 years, we had about 593 applications approved. A good majority, I want to say about 60% or more, were in those two neighborhoods, and 60% or so came in the last 3 years, as I'm going to show with this slide. As you can see, from 2007 on, 2006, the city made some changes to our development code, which initially allowed for these vacation home rentals. You can see through 2012, there wasn't a whole lot of activity. For whatever reason, or several reasons, in 2013, things really started to take off. So I think it's about 65% of the 593 approved applications that we had came in calendar years 2013, 14, and 15.
Hey, John, real quick. Hi.
Just a real quick reminder, you guys, these folks are going to weigh in editorially in between before we kick it out to Q&A. And I know we left off, Sue, just real quickly. You had brought up a distinction from VRBOs last year in numbers and this number. Can you point that out a little bit, and can you explain what a VRBO is? Okay, sure.
All right, thanks. Well, one other thing I'd like to point out too, in 2013, we did also go to council to talk about the tax. The TRT tax was suddenly brought forward and they were going to increase it. We realized at that point there was a lot of people that were out there that did not have their permits. So that did enforce the escalation to 103 to start getting people that really had to get out there and get legal so we could collect TRTs, and certainly with the increase. So that was kind of what started this. What Jamie was bringing up is that last year we were at a VRBO, and if you don't know, is vacation rental by owner. A lot of people use the engine. It's just really pretty much the go-to nowadays for people when they're going to want to use a vacation rental. So it's a #1 search engine, if you will, to go ahead and find a place anywhere. You can get gypsy caravans, TVs, Airstreams, etc. So this has always been kind of what we've used to go ahead and monitor. And frankly, when I went to the city and said, hey, we have a lot of folks out there on VRBO that are not permitted, this is your data bank. And so we started to refer to it, and it's always been kind of our go-to to really see what's happening. Last year at our peak time, which is summertime, you know, these guys get really dense for 2.5 months during summertime. At our peak, we were around 400 plus actually. Interestingly enough, with the surge of getting more permits because everybody's getting their placeholders, I thought, I'm going to see what's going on VRBO. Well, VRBO, when I looked last week, was at 424. It's really displaying what vacation rentals are really have intent to do business, and really intent to do business in my mind for this coming summer, which is happening to book very quickly now. So when John's talking about the increase, I just had mentioned to Jamie that we are starting to feel that a lot of that increase is just as placeholders. And so that would be my edit. And thank you.
Editor, yeah, absolutely. If you guys anytime, we can go either way.
Robert, Janet, would you like to?
Go ahead. Yeah.
And I'm close enough, so just grab it. Yeah. So, but I think, as Sue mentioned, there's probably a variety of reasons why we started to see an increase, a huge increase in the number of these being approved. And, you know, we TRT, transit room tax, so when you have a lodging unit, you're required by city code to remit transit room tax. What we take in throughout the city is about 15% comes from short-term rentals. So I mean, that's not insignificant. This year, you know, to date, in the calendar year, the fiscal year, we're at almost $750,000 that we brought in from taxes from these short-term rentals. So it's, you know, it's pretty significant. I think some of the trends are changing for travelers. I know when my family goes to Hood River or wherever we tend to go, we tend to stay in a vacation home rental. You can have a number of generations with you. You don't have to go out for a brief meal. You have an area to hang out. You can be in the middle of town and you get a feel for it. So it's a pleasant way to travel, but I can understand that it's also got impacts on the neighbors that might be next door. What we've also seen is just nationwide, there's this Vacation Rental Managers Association, and some of the data they've collected show that, I think it was the year 2013, approximately 25% of the travelers stayed in a short-term rental, and 50% had voiced interest in it. So I think nationally you're starting to see a different way of staying, so that you're not locked up in a hotel room where you are stuck to find the amenities you need far beyond the hotel. So those are some of the group. I do think there is a market trend that's going on that's really dictating a shift in how people are looking to travel and stay. There was also concern about black market rentals. What happens if regulation is too strict? Does this push this into an underground market? We don't know. We'll wait and see. My guess is that with the new regulations that we'll go into in a minute, council's going to want to keep tabs on this. We did do an audit, as Sue mentioned last year, to try to rectify transfer room taxes with short-term rentals, and we'll probably do those, I don't know, maybe every year or something, depending on council action, just to see if we are accurately tracking where these things are located and who's paying the taxes that they should. So, editorial comments from the group. Thanks, Rob. So, when council, and Scott was on council at this point in time, what they directed this task force to look at was really kind of 4 policy issues. Notice issues, compatibility issues, concentration, and enforcement. The way that the short-term rentals were permitted in the past, there was really no notice to the surrounding neighbors. There was no notice to surrounding neighbors, so a lot of times people didn't know that a short-term rental was approved until the first group of vacationers showed up and were unpacking their bags and walking into the house. There was also no contact for the neighbors to get in touch with when the party was going too long or they were hanging out in the hot tub and it was too loud. The first call was to the police, which probably isn't the most efficient way to deal with these things. Compatibility issues, there were parking issues, tenant behavior, a loss of sense of community. There were certain streets in the city where you're seeing, along the block, 60-70% of the homes had permits. Now, were they all being used as such for short-term rentals? We don't know, but there's definitely a number of folks who experienced the loss of long-term neighbors and really started to feel kind of the loss of their community.
John, just as a point of reference, though, during this time when we requested this audit and kind of this perspective to be looked at, how many police calls or complaints were there at the city level based on vacation rentals, just as a point of reference?
So staff went through our response data, and really from a public safety perspective, there wasn't an issue. I mean, we had police respond to a few noise complaints, but there wasn't a disproportionate amount of responses to vacation home rentals than there were to any other type of facility. So from that standpoint, there really was an issue, but I think correct me if I'm wrong, but what I saw from council at that point, that they did understand that there was a compatibility issue that needed to be better addressed.
Sure, that's very fair.
Did I hear the number like 12 complaints though?
Yeah, the number that I had heard from the enforcement membrane in the city was that there were 12 complaints that had to be addressed over a year's period of time up to this point, and actually several of those complaints were actually neighbor disputes that had been ongoing for some time, and they used the vacation rental as kind of a way to leverage that. So it was pretty minimal, and I guess the only reason I brought that up is because this issue, like many others that are contentious, sometimes the perception from the outside, if you're just reading the headlines or you're just hearing 2 or 3 people talk about it, is that this is really an unbelievably out of control situation. And I kind of wanted a point of reference as to why we didn't demand some sort of immediate action at the council level at that time, and why we decided that it would be better to really understand the overall community-wide impact instead of a small group of people that were really upset at that moment that were making a lot
So the other two policy issues that council wanted us to look at, issues of concentration. Again, there were two neighborhoods that were overwhelmingly impacted by these, as well as enforcement. And so as Scott mentioned, there wasn't much of a traditional public safety concern, but what were we doing to respond to the lower level nuisance issues, the noise that's going too long, with people partying in the hot tubs too long. And I think what the task force did wisely was try to place some of that enforcement on the management of it. So we'll get into that by providing a 24-hour contact number to all of your neighbors. Your first call can be to the manager of the unit now versus calling that. Okay, so what we came up with was a two-tiered approach as to how to manage these. We have a development code, a land use code that regulates what is permissible on basically every lot within the city. We had a very lax process to go through initially to get the vacation home rentals in place. We knew that we needed to revise our development code language, and we'll go through that in a bit, but we probably made sense to have a distance requirement or a separation requirement, probably go through notice and these types of things. So that's what we handled through the land use code. Then there was also this corresponding programmatic approach where annually you would come in and obtain a license and demonstrate that you've been using it in the manner that should be used in order to obtain your license for the next year. Land use permits are issued once, typically, that's it. That's the life of the permit. The programmatic allows there to be more of a, I guess, routine check-in to make sure that these are being operated in the manner that the community expects them to be managed.
I say just
Pretty quiet.
So can you go back to that previous slide? So that was the approach that we as a task force took. And anybody been on a task force of 23 people in the community? Lots of them. Very diverse opinions as to what we were trying to achieve. What livability means to this individual is different from that person. It got a little contentious, but I mean, frankly, everybody was pretty professional, dealt with everybody in a way that was respectful, and we made a lot of progress. And if you look at two sides to an issue, if there's those that are against rentals and those that were for them, I would say that those that owned and managed rental properties came a long way. They understood there was an issue. In every business there's good and bad actors, and I think they made a lot of progress. We made, as a task force, a lot of progress in compromising to try to accommodate both the needs of the community so that you have a neighborhood, and the needs of the businesses. Those of you that invest in buying homes, improving homes, putting furniture in those homes for the purpose of running a business, you know, you have to take into account the needs of those folks. So I feel that the direction that we went with this two-tiered approach, where we had a development code discussion and then a programmatic discussion, was flawed. I think that we have had a subcommittee that wanted to handle the programmatic issues first to address the two neighborhoods that were most impacted. But council, I think, directed us to do it the way you see it up here. And I feel that that was a little bit flawed because we didn't have a full discussion, in my personal opinion, as to how we could address it all holistically. We took one piece, then we took another. And that's just my editorial on it. It's how it went. I think that what council has adopted is pretty restrictive, and it's more restrictive than the 23-person committee presented to them, and then the planning commission revised. So I wonder, after I added it up, thousands of hours of people's time. If you add up the 23 people plus those that were city, 1,000 hours of time were essentially, in my opinion, tossed aside, and the city council made their own decision. It's kind of disappointing.
Which actually is I use this example all the time, and Jamie asked me to use it again, is that in the city council races over the last 3 cycles, the undervote, or the people who voted in national races and voted in statewide races but didn't check the box on their city council race, in my race, both races that I ran, it was 1/3 of all votes in my last race, out of 30,000 voters approximately that voted, there were 12,200, I think, in this last race that didn't vote in the city council races but voted in some other race. And these kind of things, these issues that are in your community and in your neighborhood are decided by city council, and they can be decided in the course of one evening, and to reverse those is a very impossible, nearly impossible project. So I always talk a lot about this, that you all are showing up and paying attention here tonight, which is great. So tell 10 of your friends that in the next city council election to pay attention to what the issues are, what the people who are representing you and your community are, because they might make decisions that either make you really happy or really unhappy that affect you the next term, as opposed to a federal decision or a state decision that might take 6 or 7 years to affect you.
It was tough. Segue into what Rob's statement is. We, in fairness, and I'm sorry, I see a hand up.
We'll come back around the Q&A.
The city was given a hard task to, there was a timeline that they had to get in, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had to get a place marker into legislation with a certain amount of time. And so we really had to put the cart before the horse. So in trying to make decisions that were really important, we were trying to get an awful lot of information in front of us, be fair, listen to one another, without understanding what the full picture was. And so it was like putting a roof on a house without a foundation. And where we would try and say, hey, can we segregate this and do this? We could not, because it was already established that we had to get into legislation by a certain amount of time. So with that task at hand, and with our frustration, we did our best to land where we could.
So I guess it was 4 very long months in my opinion, but to move through such an emotional community issue in 4 months is astounding. So council was responding to what they saw as a very important issue. There was this concept of declaring a moratorium on vacation home rentals. Quite frankly, we most likely don't have state law on our side to be able to declare a moratorium on vacation home rentals. So I think it was admirable that the council said, you know what, rather than sit around and tinker legally for the next 5 or 6 months about whether we can declare a moratorium, why don't we just dive into the issue, gather members of the community, and try to come up with an approach that works well for the community. So we will dive into that approach right now. So, with the new land use regulations, primarily all residentially zoned property within the city will be required to go through a Type 2 land use permit application. Basically what that means is if you have a home and you would like to apply for a short-term rental, you will need to apply to the city. You're required to provide notice to property owners within 250 feet of your property. We now have a set of criteria that you must show you meet, which we'll go into in a minute, but the big one is we will measure 250 feet around your subject property, your house, and there can't be more than one other vacation home rental within that 250 feet. And we can go into the back and forth of how that came into play, but that is the biggie of the Type 2. Notice will be provided to neighbors within 250 feet. People can appeal the decision. Those were kind of 2 big, I think, hallmarks of complaints about the other process we had. You weren't notified and you couldn't appeal the decision. So nobody likes a surprise. I get it. It makes sense. Oregon's got a land use system. Public involvement is the first rule of that. So I get the intent. One within 250 feet. Some people will say that's too restrictive. Some people will say that's too permissive. But we did listen to folks who weighed in. For instance, the Mount Bachelor Village of the world. There's 20 townhomes and broken tops that were specifically developed for short-term rentals. Didn't make sense for the city to come over on top of essentially resort-like developments that were developed in that style for us to have a whole new process to go through that wouldn't allow them to operate those properties in the way they were meant to be operated. So those were exempted. We will have a Type 1 review, so this is just, it's more of a formality. You come in, you check off that you have the very simple, but there will be, at least we're recording and tracking where these things are, and that would be required in commercial zones, the old mill district, we've been speaking with Bill Smith about that, and then other mixed employment zones.
Do we know what the cost is gonna be for that?
So a type 2 is going to run somewhere around $1,800 for the application. The type 1 is around $430, $450.
And John, just again to clarify, that all of these rules that are instigated are not applicable to businesses already in business because of land use law, is that correct?
So next slide.
Yeah.
Yes. So we'll get into that because that was a big discussion. Also, the task force came up with this concept of what if I own my home and I'm going away for the Christmas holidays, or I'm going away for a couple of weeks in the summer. I'd like to rent out my place, perhaps recoup some of the costs of my trip. Do I need to go through this whole type 2 process? And they recommended 20 days, I think, 20 days or fewer. You could just go through a type 2. The way that our remittance works for short-term rental tax is that by state law we don't start collecting tax until you've rented it for more than 29 days. To make things simple for the city in terms of implementing this, we said why not have these infrequent short-term rentals tied to that 29-day maximum. So that is what the council is moving forward with. So again, it's a lot of these things that the debates come down to what makes sense sometimes and what's implementable, and that is one of those particular compromises.
So you have about 3 or 4 more slides left. If you want to go ahead and keep a good clip, and we'll just do editorials. I see a. Is that wrong? I was just thinking. I'm noticing some questions out there, and then some editorial. We'll get to everybody out.
So to hit Scott's point, existing permitted short-term rentals, so the 593 that have applications, or excuse me, approvals in hand, those will continue to run with the land. Moving forward, if you get an approval for your house to run a short-term rental, that approval is only going to run with the owner. So it won't apply to the land. So if you sell that property, the new owner would need to come in. If they wanted to continue running it as a short-term rental, they would need to go through the same process in order to obtain the approval, which may or may not be possible. We're also, I'll get to the second point in a second. The short-term room rentals. So the task force didn't really want to start deciphering between a short-term room rental and what's the Airbnb. So they're subject to the same rules and regulations as the short-term rental. So if you're just renting one room in your house, you still have the separation distance and the type 2 requirement.
Important to note, it is not going to be included in the density factor. Is that correct? The Airbnbs will not be included in the density factor.
Sally's fascinated as well.
Yeah. That was my understanding too, is that the Airbnb, and if you had somebody in the home who is renting a room out, that would be a type 1 and not a type 2, and that would not, and therefore not be submitted to the density requirements that type 2 would be. So, yeah, they're excluded. Yeah. It's pretty damn technical, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It's literally. So moving on into the River West and Old Bend capacity. So with these new regulations, this dark orange, and I apologize, this map doesn't work very well, but the dark orange are areas with the new separation distances and 1 per 250. All these dark orange areas are at capacity. So until there's some attrition, there will be no short-term rentals approved within those dark orange areas.
We're starting to get where we're getting a lot of questions out of the audience, and I know we said we'd wait for the presentation to end.
Just keep going with the presentation.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's,
So again, just showing how some things would work in terms of the mapping. On the left is kind of downtown 5,000 square foot lots. You're looking at about 41 properties within a 250 foot radius. There can only be one within there. Moving into kind of larger lots, again, you can see the number of lots within that area decrease, but the 1 per 250 feet is the regulation that council is planning to move forward with.
We'll have this PowerPoint available on the chamber website, as well as this is being YouTubed this evening to also find later.
Okay, on the programmatic next side, this is your annual licensing requirement. So you'll need to come in each year, submit an application, and show that you have used your vacation home rental or short-term rental once within the last 12 months. So that's what you need to do in order to keep your land use approval alive and be able to obtain your annual operating license. This is kind of a use it or lose it provision that the task force discussed for quite a while. You'll be required to have a 24-hour contact that will be provided to neighbors. We're going to develop a portion of the website that if you type in the address of a short-term rental, because the party's going too late, the number will pop up so you can call the manager so they can respond to it. There's a self-inspection fire safety requirement, so you need to go through and show that you have the right amount of smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, and fire extinguishers on site. We will be tracking violations, so we have a system in place that will allow enforcement if you are found to have violated. Let's say that the noise code always comes up. If you have a violation for that, 1 violation would be a warning, 2 would be a suspension, 3 would be a revocation. But there is flexibility in there that if the first or second violation were so egregious, we could skip a step or 2. So if things go Animal House on us, you could go straight to suspension. So
as a manager, we started to get concerned about the fact that some of these people were going to use this as a tool.
yeah.
And that was a big concern, and we got pretty loud about that because it's really, in some aspect, our only aspect that we could lose control. So we've asked the city to put in position something that is going to really make sure that these are authenticated complaints, and that's just something to just be aware and mindful of. It's really important.
That's why we focused on violations. One other item related to that is kind of the squeaky wheel syndrome. But if you are calling the short-term rental next door because they are having the party that's going too long and they're not responding, we now have a program coordinator who's going to implement this licensing program. If you contact Lorelei and she finds that you have some credible complaints, if she starts contacting the manager and they're not responding to her, at that point in time we can initiate enforcement action as well. So it was kind of looked at from both sides to make sure that there wasn't a squeaky wheel syndrome, but there was also not the deaf manager or something. We came up with good neighbor guidelines, so a subset of the task force put these together. You'll have to hand out these to each tenant. Have a parking diagram where they should be parking first before parking in the streets. Let folks know you need to turn down the music at 10. Clean up after your pet. Be nice to your neighbors. Respect folks in your residential neighborhood. Just kind of the basic tenets of life. Use good judgment. Don't be a jerk. And then enforcement. Again, this is another enforcement tool where by having this annual monitoring of what's going on, it provides the city the ability to deal with the bad actors that, I'm thinking market trends will weed them out of the market anyway, but provides another hammer, so to speak. So moving forward, what to expect? A week from tomorrow, April 15th, council will have a second reading for an emergency adoption of this combined program. That means on April 16th, if it gets approved, the land use changes, so the type 2 requirements, the distance requirement, one within the 250 feet, would go into effect April 16th. July 2015, existing permit holders will be notified that this annual operating license is going to be required, and it looks like it's September, beginning September, that the annual operating license will be required. So between July and September, existing permit holders will be permitted to get their operating license.
Hey, just real quick, I was noticing Janet's had a couple of editorial comments she's waited on before we kick out as well. So let's, if we could move quickly.
There were a couple things that were brought up tonight that I won't say were glossed over, but from Central Oregon Association of Realtors, there's a couple of issues that we really focused in on because we felt like
was up first, and then at the back there.
This one you just have to talk real close.
So I own a management company. We manage homeowners associations. So I'm quite familiar with managing boards of directors that are pretty similar to a microcosm of city government. And I frequently see boards of directors that take a vocal minority and make a